Hello, so I'm going to talk about schizophrenia and focus more specifically on auditory hallucinations. It's a subject that sparked my interest a few years ago, and also I have one of my coworker who has bipolar disorder and really recently experienced schizophrenic episodes. So schizophrenia is characterized by experiencing delusions, hallucinations, disordered thinking, and disorganized behavior. It's usually triggered around your 20s, and even though we don't know what exactly causes it, we know that genetic factor is involved in developing the disease. So, when I asked my friend to describe one of her auditory hallucinations, she said that once she could hear kind of like a deep voice laughing, crystal clear voice, like if it's real. So to understand how this mechanism and this phenomenon is happening, let's look at a brain scan of someone who's experiencing hallucination. And it shows that the primary auditory cortex is active, which is located in the temporal lobe, and it's responsible for changing inputs into a perception. So without this region, you wouldn't be able to hear anything consciously whatsoever. So this region is active, and there's also the Wernicke's and Broca's regions that are active. They're both located in the superior temporal lobe, and Wernicke's area is responsible for creating meaning with words and understanding meaning as well, and Broca's area is responsible for producing meaning and translating meaning into spoken word or written word. So those two areas are active, and they're responsible for forming the hallucination, forming sentences that's built, that makes sense. And then it's linked to the primary auditory cortex that changes this thought into perception of something that's really heard. The interesting thing is that there's also on the other side of the brain, the non-dominant side, the region responsible for producing prosody, who's active as well, which would explain why most hallucinations have kind of like this emotional tone to it, and why my friend was experiencing kind of like this laugh, and not just like a neutral sentence. So we know now how the hallucination is created in the brain, but we don't know what causes it. And the thing is, to this day, scientists are not sure to what really causes it or triggers it. There are, though, two main hypotheses. The first one is that it comes from your inner voice, internal speech that is then misinterpreted as something that comes from the outside world. So you remember when the course talked about the afferent messages and the afferent messages? So usually your brain sends messages, afferents copy messages to other part of your brain, usually to predict future sensory inputs and to inhibit them. So this works when I'm currently speaking, my brain is sending a afferent message to my ear, so it identifies my own voice and inhibits it a bit, so I'm not constantly being distracted by it. It works as well when someone tickles. When you tickle yourself, and it doesn't tickle because your brain predicts where your fingers are going to touch your skin. And the interesting thing is that it's shown in studies that people with schizophrenia have a harder time distinguishing what comes from themselves and what doesn't come, and have like a defective self-monitoring system, and that it would actually be more likely to tickle themselves, for example. So this would explain why the brain is actually have a hard time knowing why those regions are active in the brain, when Wernicke and Broca's regions are active, and if it does come from just a thought or if it comes from the outside world. And so there goes the hallucination. The second hypothesis comes from implies that your memory is actually triggering by itself some memories that are then interpreted as something coming from the outside world. So the thing is that there are a few regions that are hyperactive in schizophrenic brains. Those regions are thalamus and the hypothalamus. Both are located in diencephalon, so in the base of your brain, and are responsible for memory. There's also the basal ganglia that's hyperactive. So the basal ganglia is kind of like a cluster of neurons that hold a kind of like a set of all the actions you can do and constantly inhibit those actions. But once you inhibit the inhibitor, one action is released and you're able to move. So the basal ganglia is hyperactive, and the interesting thing is that in Parkinson's disease, people with Parkinson's disease that receive medication usually have too much dopamine, and so they're inhibiting too much inhibitors and have those like kind of like movements that are triggered by themselves, and they're not consciously like triggering them. And this mechanism could actually work the same way in people with schizophrenia, because people in schizophrenia also have an overproduction of dopamine and glutamate. Glutamate is another neurotransmitter that's linked to memory as well. And so maybe, same way as it works with people with dyskinesia, people with schizophrenia could have a memory thalamus and hypothalamus that would be like over-solicited and then fire spontaneously those memories that would then become hallucinations. So here are the two main hypotheses right now. I hope you enjoyed hearing them, and I'm sorry because I caricaturized a lot so it could fit in a few minutes video. In real, it's way more complex, but I hope it helped you understand a bit more how it's working. I'm gonna finish by saying how this course helped me understand a lot better how the human brain works, and I thought of it as something that's kind of like a uniform thing, continuous thing, well-rounded, that is pretty much able to carry out any task. And in real, this course really helps you understand how the brain is just like composed of so many different and very specific regions that carry out very specific tasks and create really the illusion that it's kind of like a uniform thing. But in real, it's very different. And so if you have a stroke, for example, in the visual cortex, you're able to carry out all the tasks perfectly. You're able to see everything. But for example, when someone pours some water into a glass, you see everything but the motion, and the motion is gone, but everything else works fine. So this is kind of like a bit amazing to think about how we're just machines. The second thing that this course helped me understand and is that when they talked about all the conditions that could happen and all the processes, it made me feel lucky, actually, not to have developed any of those conditions. And I realized how so many things could go wrong in some ways, and yet, for most of us, all those things work just fine. And I thought it was something, normal before, and I realized how lucky I am to be able to express myself in a fluent way without thinking about it, being able to see, being able to touch. So yeah, thank you for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I am sorry for the length